Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can also access our podcast at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Grant Newsham, a retired U.S. Marine colonel and the first U.S. Marine Liaison Officer to Japan's Ground Self-Defense Force. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and is also a research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, focusing on Asia-Pacific defense, political, and economic matters. He also served as Reserve Head of Intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific and was a U.S. Marine Attaché, U.S. Embassy Tokyo, on 2 occasions. Grant lived in Tokyo for 20 years and worked over a decade in executive roles at a Western investment bank and major American high-tech firm. He's also a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with work covering numerous regions, including East and South Asia, and specializing in insurgency, counterinsurgency, and commercial matters. He's also an attorney with experience in international trade, public international law. He speaks regularly at a variety of forums on Asian affairs and is widely published. Grant is the author of When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Will America fight back? The new Cold War that Communist China is waging against America and its allies. The conflict is coming. We're not ready. China is already attacking America. Is American defeat inevitable? No, but we must change course immediately. Well, that's the jacket blurb that ought to pique your attention, and we'll get into that and more in today's conversation. And with that, Grant, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Sure. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Well, as I warned before the show began, we like to talk with our guests a little bit before getting into the deep subject matter about who they are and maybe what some of the interesting and formative experiences were. From your bio, it's pretty clear you joined the U.S. Marine Corps at some point. But when you were growing up, did you say, hey, one day I want to be a soldier and I'm going to serve in Japan and other cool places? Or did you have other ideas in mind as you were growing up?
Oh, I don't know. I think a lot of people, especially back in my era, who watched a lot of Davy Crockett movies, at some point they thought maybe you'll give the military a try. So it wasn't all that unusual. You pretty much knew, that it would be either the military or certainly wasn't going to be real estate development. But it was just a natural thing that, for people my era. But also I was a liberal arts graduate. So which means you've got some would say charitably that you're interested in a lot of different things. Others would say you have a really short attention span. So I ended up ultimately in the Marines, but I joined when I was almost 28 years old, which is a little bit
different.
Yeah, it's a little older. But I had also gone to law school, been a lawyer for a little while, and had knocked around Africa a bit. And then after I joined the Marines, it was peacetime. So it's kind of boring. So like a lot of people do, after your initial contract, you go in the reserves. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of have 2 careers at once. And I ended up working for the U.S. State Department for about 8-9 years, and then went to work for Motorola. If you remember that company that committed suicide going into China. And if I was as smart as I think I am, I wouldn't have invested in the employee stock program. And then I ended up working for an investment bank for over a decade, most of this in Tokyo, and at the same time was doing the Marine thing. And there was plenty to do. And as you noted in the bio, I was the attaché a couple times. But the last job was the most interesting, because I had gotten some vague orders to come on active duty. It was after the tsunami earthquake in Japan in 2011. And I and another Marine and some Japanese, we always figured that if we ever get the chance, we're going to give Japan an amphibious capability. So that's what we did. And that was the last 3 years of basically my service, is that working with the Japanese, we gave them the amphibious force they have now, or the beginning of it. And the secret to all of that, I was asked once, is, well, how do you manage this? Because it was thought impossible. So what I told the guy was, thinking about it, well, we didn't ask permission. If we had told PACOM or US Indo-PACOM what we were doing, they'd still be working on the PowerPoint slide deck. So those are just some of the things that I've done. It's all pretty much just an accumulation of experiences that leave you with a bunch of good stories to tell.
Yeah, well, they are good stories, and they're good places to have them too. But before we get into the China parts of things, were things international or military service in the family, or were you a trailblazer in going down these paths?
Oh no, like a lot of people my age, all our fathers had been in World War II. And so you would grow up hearing stories about that. My father's case, he was in India and Ceylon and that area. So you grow up with these sorts of stories. And as I said, it sort of leads you in a certain direction. And you do have the sense that overseas is interesting, America is boring. Well, it really isn't, but that's how it seems. And it always seems exotic when you are overseas. So there was a sort of a real interest in it. And I suppose I've done a bit more of it than most of my brothers and sister.
Well, you do find that a lot of people who serve in the military, high percentage, are legacies of others in their family having served and sort of feel extra inclined to do it. It's not 100%, but it's a high percentage. But you might have felt the same way. I was on the path to enlisting or trying to get into one of the academies or something like that, but life took me in a very, very different direction. But I never fell as deeply in love with America as after having served for a sustained period overseas, and you come back and you sort of have fresh eyes on things. You discover you've got an accent you didn't know you had. You discover the house is much more plush than you thought it was because you've lived in very different accommodations. And it's just one of those life experiences I highly recommend for those that are contemplating it. But I think that you've had a fantastic trajectory. Number one, Japan is a fantastic place to know and to serve. Sure, there's going to be some challenges. I'd love to hear what some of them might have been. But for the most part, it's great work with a great ally. I don't know too many people who've been attaché twice. You're in that select club. Do you know how rare that is?
It's a little unusual, but the part of the reason was because I was in Japan, so I lived there. And the Marines never had an attaché at the embassy until about the year 2000. None.
Yeah.
As a
Where are
military,
Marines usually at an embassy?
well, they were the guards, of
Yeah.
course, but they never had an attaché,
Yeah.
despite the Marines having like almost 20,000 people down in Okinawa.
Yeah.
And this was really a power play at work where the US Army was keeping the Marines out of the embassy, out of Tokyo. So the Army was saying, we'll take care of your interests. And as a result, the Marines really hadn't advanced their relationship with the Japanese military very much at all. So I was actually the very first one that they put in. So I spent some time trying to fend off the Navy and the Army trying to sabotage the Marines.
Can
And
only imagine.
I'm not really joking. I mean, you had to see it to believe it. But ultimately, that position got really solidified. And then I came back a few years later when they needed somebody to fill in. But it was always sort of odd, not odd, but I found it very interesting. When I was in Japan, living there, really was my home, and particularly working with the Japanese military, because I grew up with stories of the River Kwai camps.
Yep.
And the war. And we all had a certain image of Japan and the Japanese. And like a lot of things, with the passage of time, but also familiarity changes. And I was thought it just astonishing when you think about it sometimes that you have a Marine helping the Japanese create an amphibious force. And this was actually considered taboo, even in parts of the US government. But it's a different Japan. It has no real
That's a very
relationship
important
to
point.
the one of the 30s and 40s. Just like the Vikings are not the Danes, or the Danes are not the Vikings. So it was always, but I always found it ironic in a way, but also very interesting to see how people who wanted to exterminate each other could become very good friends, and ultimately the two main powers defending freedom in the region, and I would suggest globally as well.
Completely agree on that broad point. Let's pivot a little bit into your work from that privileged perch in Japan to now focusing on a broad strategic challenge coming from China. They're not separate experiences. I trust that you gathered a great deal of experience about the nature of the challenges China posed from being in that allied and leadership position forward deployed in Asia. But talk a little bit before we get into the meat of the book about what led you from that kind of work to where you work now and how it got into this book project.
Actually, about maybe 6, 7 years ago, I decided, well, I've lived long enough and maybe done a few things that be of interest and may have some ideas that would be of interest. So I started writing, writing sort of op-eds and that sort of thing, and ultimately doing a little speaking. But I'd always thought you had to be older and have done something before you actually were part of the commentariat. I see that's not a
And now we
requirement.
are.
Right? It's not a requirement, but I was, of course, took me 30, 40 years to figure it out. But I thought I had a few ideas, so I would start writing, and usually about Asian defense, sometimes the economy, and political matters as well, sometimes about organized crime. That's sort of something I didn't mention, but I got to know the Japanese Yakuza very well. But so I would write a lot. And you can't be in this field in Asia without dealing with China, without talking about China. And it had been on my radar screen when I was with the US Embassy, when I was on active duty with the Marines, and you knew it was coming. And I remember telling a friend at the embassy in 1995-ish or so when we were there, and I said, look, with all the problems we're having with the Japanese, and it was contentious because of trade relations in particular, that I said, look, we're going to look back fondly on these days once China gets up and running, because you knew China, you knew what communist systems are, you knew what these kind of regimes are, and they were telling us what they were going to do, and you knew it was coming. So China has always featured in what I've been doing really over the last 30 years. And in fact, when I got started in law, my thing was actually business with China, because China was at that time opening up to Western companies, etc. And then when I worked for Motorola, of course, we had operations in China, and I had some involvement with that, and also with really with our approach into China. That was very ill advised, and ultimately the company paid for it, I think.
Yeah, well, let's now get to the main event, the main dish of today's conversation. Grant, why don't you share with us kind of the core theme that brought you to this warning to America?
Probably the core theme was a publisher contacted me and asked me if I'd write a book. They asked me, and I thought it would be spend a couple of weekends, at the double wide trailer in North Carolina with a manual typewriter and some typing paper. It took about 8, 9 months.
Yeah.
But what the book was about, and it was my chance to tell the story of sort of what's the deal with China. Because people who don't live and breathe foreign affairs or Asia, they may have some vague sense that China's out there as an issue, but they don't quite know exactly what it is. So I wrote a book that was pretty much like if someone said, okay, Newsham, what do we need to know about China? This is what I would say. And the way that I structured it was to really tell a war story. It isn't a Tom Clancy sort of techno thriller. Others can write those books and have written them and written good ones. But rather, part of my experience has been involved in political warfare. And that just means using every aspect of national power short of shooting. to get sort of national objectives achieved. And in that, you have psychological warfare, economic warfare, financial warfare, drug warfare, etc. And so I was going to tell that story. And when you think about it, that you realize that China has already been at war with us. And that's the point I'm getting across. It's also why the title of the book has two meanings. It could be something in the future, but what I'm getting across is China is already attacking. And that's how they see it, even if we don't. And I wanted to explain the assault that we've been under from different fronts and just how effective it has been in weakening American defenses, weakening our sort of our psychological strength, weakening our economy, etc. And point this out, and then also explain how we do something about it, but also trying to put the so-called kinetic part of the equation. And kinetic warfare is sort of the cool word for shooting people. And that is actually really just the last step in the way the Chinese operate. Whereas we see it as the beginning and something discrete, to the Chinese, it's just the last step, if it's even necessary, of a much more complex, non-kinetic, non-shooting attack, war against their main enemy, and that's the word that they use. So I wanted to tell that story. And a lot of it is, I think, people, you read it, and I wanted them to say, oh, I recognize this. I see what's happening. I see how it fits into a sort of a larger strategy. And the idea was ultimately to wake up the United States while also just giving my take on things.
Well, there seem to be two broad baskets that kind of fill the agenda that you're covering in the book, and that a lot of us end up having to talk about when trying to awaken people to the challenges underway. One is, I think, as you've kind of outlined, as there's a covert war that's already underway. And maybe that's not the entirety of it. It's not all covert in the sense that it's just not declared, but it's ongoing. And whether it's IP theft or influence operations, things that undermine our institutions, political warfare generally, something that I think is broadly underappreciated, maybe marginalized in a lot of American strategic thought, but very core to how China operates. And in the Western tradition, it was also core. I don't know why we seem to have forgotten it in some ways. But so there's this covert war or undeclared war that's already happening within our boundaries. But then there's this other basket that I think falls into sort of the gray zone activities. It's not, as you say, that final step of shooting war, but there's already confrontation, escalation. There's contention and clashes going on now. And I think that the current buzzword is sort of this gray zone activity. Am I summing it up incorrectly?
No, it's got it right. It's certainly well within the ballpark. The so-called gray zone activities, I'll just start there. That's the latest sort of cool expression.
Right.
And you'll notice how when Americans hear it, when Westerners hear it, it paralyzes them. They just have no idea what to do. It's almost like a sort of an incantation that causes us to lose our minds. It's gray zone. It's just too hard to figure out. It's too hard to do something about it. Well, maybe look at it the way the Chinese look at it, which is a form of warfare. And it wears us down. It sort of erodes our capabilities. It splits us from our friends particularly when the Chinese go after them with gray zone, and we do nothing, as the Filipinos have learned. And it is very much a form of warfare as the Chinese see it. You have to respond to it in that way. But that
gray zone almost sounds fuzzy and okay. I mean, it doesn't sound that scary.
Oh,
so in some ways, it's a soothing way of talking about it when it's actually someone is mugging you.
Very much it. It's use the hoodlum, who's right in your face and he's got his arms around you, but he's not touching you. And he's telling you, I want your stuff. I'm going to kill you if you do anything. And but unless he touches you, well, we just don't know what to do. And it is just you've got to hand it to the Chinese for having understood American psyches and our psychology very well. And they have played this nicely, and until we actually push back, until we're ready to sink them. If they get, say, a Chinese ship gets in our way, until you're actually willing to defend yourself and demonstrate that you're not going to have any great success, and you'll find your position gradually just overwhelmed. But the gray zone activities, those are things that you use, say, your Navy, your Coast Guard, your fishing ships or fishing fleet to carry out. But as you were describing, there's a lot of other lines of attack as part of a Chinese political warfare strategy. And as I mentioned, some of them is the economic warfare. When you have US companies that moved en masse to China in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and left behind nothing other than neighborhoods full of drug-addled people who had no prospects. And it was Chinese drug warfare, which came in from China, which really finished off those neighborhoods. So economic warfare. And as I mentioned, there's also something called proxy warfare, which means you get the influential elite people in a country to do your bidding.
Yeah.
And that has been immensely successful in the United States, not to mention other countries as well. And that is very much a strategy that the Chinese use. I've mentioned psychological warfare. And ultimately, that's what you want to do, is you want your enemy to actually think the way you want him to think, and even to think that there's nothing he can possibly do, to think there's no real threat. How many times have you heard the expression, well, China's not really communist, they just want to make money? Or, well, China's never attacked anybody. Well, ask the Tibetans that, ask the Japanese that, ask the North Vietnamese, etc. You hear a lot of these things, and one of the classic expressions that you heard was in the 90s. It was said by actually Professor Joseph Nye, who was then at the U.S. Department of Defense, and he basically laid out their approach to China, which was, well, if you want China to be an enemy, treat them like one. And if you don't want them to be an enemy, don't treat them like. And that was what we did. We made sure that we accommodated the PRC. We gave them what they wanted. We did not criticize them. We took no countermeasures when they misbehaved or did not live up to their promises, because if we just treated them nicely, they would become like Canadians at some point, apparently.
Yeah.
But if you can get prominent people to think that way, that you have really hit, it's a grand slam, and they keep hitting them. And I would note that, just if you say, well, come on, Newsham, you're overstating it. Well, I would suggest read any one of Peter Schweitzer's books. And you'll note that he names names. And you will also note nobody ever sues him.
Yeah.
This is just astonishing. And I noticed just today that the former attorney, Loretta Lynch, the former attorney general, she's working for DJI, the Chinese drone company. And boy, if you put money in front of a Westerner, they will generally perform like a sea lion at SeaWorld or some water park.
Yeah. That's one of the ancient tools that's never changed civilization to civilization, and they're doing it to a fare thee well. I really don't think people appreciate enough what you were articulating at how effective this psychological warfare is, elite capture and using others to do your bidding for you. It's extremely successful. And it is very, very widespread. It's been going on for decades. One can argue it was going from Kissinger forward. In some ways, the decades he was the bard of all things foreign policy, he was basically singing in harmony with the tune you were just describing that Vogel and others, Nye along them, would all kind of preach from the Ivy Leagues that, if we treat them as a great responsible power and integrate them into things, that it will have this normative effect, and areas of cooperation will expand and areas of conflict will narrow. Of course, that doesn't really pass the sobriety check when you look at results, but they suspend that disbelief extremely effectively. And of course, the argument you accurately summed up about, well, the surest way to make an enemy out of China is to treat it like an enemy. Well, they never applied that logic to the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing itself, because they kind of treat us in a certain way. And for some reason, in those real highfalutin brains, they didn't compute that this is a two-way street of communication and interaction. But you've got it in the book. I want to kind of go a little bit deeper on the challenges within before we go to the challenges that are external and geopolitical, back to your starting points of being positioned and forward deployed in Asia and what we face with a rising CCP being expansionist now. But the threat within, I mean, our audience knows I've talked at length in multiple episodes about things ranging from influence operations, also COVID, but also painfully about fentanyl, because I lost my own daughter to that. And there's hundreds of thousands of American casualties to this. It is not by accident or out of ignorance that this is happening. And just historically, I can't think of a single instance in civilization where so many citizens of any country, kingdom, or family were actually killed without some kind of a major military response. But here we are.
I can't either. The numbers are close to 1 million now from when the time the fentanyl assault happened. And you'll notice there has been absolutely no pushback, no punishment for the Chinese Communist Party having done this. None. And that's by neither party has done anything. In fact, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is that I got a phone call at my think tank where I was working. And it was from a fellow who somehow tracked me down because I'd written an article about fentanyl. And his son had died, had been killed by Chinese fentanyl. And the guy was just distraught. And he was like he was a former Navy officer, just distraught by all of this, and particularly by the lack of concern on the part of his representatives. Yeah, they talked a good game, but they ultimately did nothing. And this is a story that has been repeated. I don't have to tell you, but it's been repeated so many times and nothing has happened. And what they have done, in the last figures last year was about 70,000 dead, over 70,000. And that's going on since about 2012, 2013, and the numbers have gone up. So you can't figure that out. And that is like every year you are taking, it's the equivalent of 2 or 3 divisions off the battlefield of your enemy.
It's a Vietnam War every year.
Well, it's more than the Vietnam War every year. And you notice that these are people who would normally be potential candidates to join the military. Yes. And here you have the Chinese who are providing about 99% of this drug, and they pump it into the United States, and they just sit back and watch. And these are just the people who've been killed by it, the 70,000, the ones who can no longer function, the families that have been affected by this, employers who can't find people to fill jobs because they can't hire drug users. This is just a win-win from China's perspective. But the really amazing thing is there has been really no reaction from the U.S. government. Instead of pulling the People's Bank of China's license to operate permanently, or something like that. There's just nothing. And as a result, you're going to get more of it, and the Chinese like what they see. And it is actually, from Chinese perspective, this is a form of warfare. They call it drug warfare. But this really is the one that gets across just how effective China has been in its political warfare effort. And I include drug warfare as political warfare. I use that expression. Just how effective they've been. When you can kill almost 1 million of your enemy's people and he does absolutely nothing.
Yeah. And it comes back and wants to have a working group to discuss it.
Well, that was it. And they claim that, Team Biden says this is a great success. We're going to talk about, we got the Chinese to agree to talk with us again, to maybe do something about it. Well, here's my test. If you say the Chinese can't stop it, well, go to Beijing or go anywhere in China and go out from your hotel and draw a mustache on a picture of Xi Jinping and see if the police are there at your hotel before you get there 5 minutes after. This is a surveillance state that Orwell couldn't have dreamed of. And all the Chinese have to say is, well, there's nothing we can do. And they have their proxies, the people who are getting rich off of the PRC, uh, glad to say, yeah, well, I guess you're right, you can't do anything. But this to me is the litmus test. If you won't do anything to people that are killing your people by the hundreds of thousands, you know, what will you defend yourself?
I
What
think
does
that's
it
an
take to
incredibly important point we
yeah,
can't say enough. It
well,
really has to get through.
the book has a chapter about it. But it leaves one really just stunned. And this is our, as I said, these are our representatives, and what exactly have they done to stop it?
Yeah.
I'm afraid nothing, and that, as I say, has been a bipartisan accomplishment.
Well, I agree completely that it basically takes a generation that a normal country relies upon to recruit for the best fighting force known to mankind. So we've taken ourselves down a notch without them having to contend with us. It also takes out what needs to be the most employable foundation part of our economy, where people who are the go-getters, the strugglers, the laborers, the foundation to make this engine run, to be maybe some of those breakout entrepreneurs, that if you start paralyzing them with psychological warfare like TikTok and other addictive things, plus this toxin, you've really given it's a double barrel shotgun to your enemy who's taken itself down without you having to do anything. To me, it seems obvious. To you, it would sound from our conversation, it's also obvious. We've got to get more people to kind of sense this very clear picture, I think. But sadly, the Homeland Security part of this, our families, our communities, our own institutions aren't the only battle space for this. There is still a world out there. You've lived it. There's a lot of life out on the high seas. There's a lot of life forward deployed out there. Talk a little bit about the nature of what's changed and what you see as kind of the cutting edge of what the CCP is doing to push the horizons in the classical military sense in the broader Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, the Chinese military is one people used to laugh at it about 15, 20 years ago. The joke about, say, a Chinese attack on Taiwan was that it would be a million-man swim. The idea being, well, they just don't have the ships, they don't have the know-how to get across the strait, and they would laugh at it. And this was the military that would do it as much as anyone. I remember in 2016 or so telling the Marines that before long you're going to find Chinese amphibious units, the equivalent of our MEUs, the Marine Expeditionary Units, out and about in Asia making the rounds. And eyes would roll if they didn't just laugh at me, because everyone knew the Chinese aren't as smart as us, would never be our equals. And there was very much a condescension in dealing with the PRC, with the Chinese. And this was ill-advised, and I think it was one of the reasons we let our guard down. It's just one of them. But back to my point is that the Chinese military in the last 15 years has become something that nobody ought to laugh about. They have improved their capabilities, their hardware, their ability to use it, and they are just getting better and better and better. You look at and the speed with which they do it is invariably a decade faster than the experts predict. The idea was, well, they'll never have aircraft carriers. They're not smart enough. And it took us 80 years to figure it out, so it'll take them 180. Well, it didn't. And they're improving quickly, and their objective is global. They're putting in the physical infrastructure, getting the access to airfields, naval ports around the world, and also creating a military that can operate globally, that has the long-range transports. It has the naval supply, these replenishment ships. And they've demonstrated that they can operate in all parts of the globe. Maybe not like we can, but they are moving along quickly, and that's their objective. Now, within Asia, close to China, that they pretty much dominate. And they have de facto control of the South China Sea, and they have since 7, 8 years ago. So you do hear the Americans talking about how we go through the South China Sea and nobody can stop us. But this is like the olden days in New York City. Remember Times Square before Rudy Giuliani cleaned it up?
Oh, yes.
You could send an NYPD squad car through, and it would part the human flotsam, the criminals, and they controlled that little bit. And then once it went through, it closed back up, and you knew who controlled it. And that's what the Chinese have in the South China Sea now. Yes, we could fight our way into it, but it would be bloody. And if the Chinese pick their spots, pick their timing, they could give us a very, very bloody nose if it's fairly close to the Chinese mainland. The farther away from that you get, we have the advantage still. But the Chinese are getting better and better. And they are turning out military hardware at a rate that we can only dream of. The figure that has finally been publicized recently is their shipbuilding capacity is 200 times that of the United States, and that's 200. So militarily, they are, say, nothing to sneer at. And their Navy in particular, their Air Force, yes, they've got a lot to figure out, and they have problems just like any military. But you look back 10 years, 15 years at where they were, and they have come a long way very fast, and nobody's laughing. Our hope, of course, is that somehow we wake up and sort of revitalize our military. But I'm not sure what it's going to take to wake us up. But then you will hear, well, we have allies. We have the Japanese, the Australians, the Filipinos, the Koreans. Well, we do. And then ask yourself, well, with which one of them can we do a real world short notice operation? That means go out with them on no notice and fight. The Koreans in limited circumstances. Other than that, it's a very short list with nobody on it. So we comfort ourselves that we have allies, but are they actually able to fight with us? Are they willing to do it? Well, we ought to keep score and see where we really are in that respect. So this is it's a situation we've allowed to develop where we now face an enemy, and we now have to deal with the threat or the fear that we actually might be driven out of Asia. It doesn't mean it's going to happen or has to happen, but now we have somebody who could potentially do it. And that has happened while we were sitting on our hands.
Well, before we get into the final stages of the conversation and try to talk about some of the prescriptions that might heal this wounded superpower and maybe get us back onto a proper course, I just think that one of the most shameful parts of this mugging is that the People's Liberation Army is doing a lot of this with the money and technology that we gave them. And so there's a very high correlation of a boomerang effect of we did this and now it's coming back in ways that are threatening us, manipulating us, and also hurting our allies. And so, well, if we did it, that must mean we have some capability to fix this. Maybe first stop doing the harmful stuff. But before I put too many words in your mouth, whether it's from your book or from the mind that brought the book to us, what are some of your priorities for if there were a leader of the United States who took a pause and took stock? What are sort of the short list of things that you would put out there to get the homeland and the forward deployed parts of American power and goodwill back in place?
Well, a lot of people overseas are looking to see what the Americans are going to do. Do they show that they're serious about defending themselves and ultimately defending freedom, defending free nations? And they're watching that very closely. And that is where the leader does matter. Is it somebody who's taken seriously? And does the leader actually see that we are at war, actually understand that? But you've got to talk to the American people, convince them of the threat they face, and that we need to do something about it. And often if you level with the American people, they'll respond. Wall Street and the business community, or a lot of the business community and academia is probably going to take something more strict or more harder than that, like a club to the head. But nonetheless, the American people, I'm not concerned about them at all if there's a leader who makes that case. And I say foreigners are watching that. But in terms of what we do about it, this is where, of course, there's no substitute for hard power. And that is a military that can take on anybody that wants to challenge us and destroy them in an afternoon. It has to be that. There's no substitute for it. And we don't spend enough on defense. We don't spend it on the right things. We don't spend like we are at war and about to lose one. And we got to do that. But there's more to it than just the hard power, because you can get the military part right and still lose. And you've covered that. And it's in my book as well. And I've seen this firsthand with Motorola and also at the bank that I work for, a Wall Street firm that everyone would have heard of. And we have genuinely funded the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party's buildup. We've provided the funds and the technology that has allowed it to get where it is. And it sounds astonishing, and I can't think of a historic example like that. And what's often not recognized, and this is a huge vulnerability for the Chinese communists, is that the Chinese currency is not really convertible. So it's like the script that you get at a high school carnival. You can use it at the carnival to buy caramel corn and cotton candy, but take it off the campus and nobody wants it. And that's the problem the Chinese communists have always had. But we have poured in huge amounts of foreign direct investment into China by moving our factories and companies over to China to manufacture. We buy things from them. We provide them the foreign currency that they need, the convertible currency that they use to buy Australian iron ore to make steel, to make their navy. It gives them the money they need to buy American technology companies back before we sort of woke up. But we've really funded the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese economy is a Ponzi scheme. And if you choke off that flow, it is going to have some serious problems very fast. So what you do is you hit them where they're vulnerable. You choke off that the money flow, make it very hard to invest in China, and also be much tougher than we have been on technology exports, and that includes foreigners who would take our technology and slip it into China as well. You've really got to crack down on this. And another thing that I would like to do is expose the corruption of China's top leaders, and that is their foreign real estate, their bank accounts, their relatives who have green cards, the businesses that they own. This should be exposed to high heaven so all 1.4 billion Chinese people know about it. And because this is what you do if you want to make it personal. The Chinese communist leaders are glad to let the Chinese people absorb any amount of punishment. But when it hits them personally, they respond very differently. And we know how well this works because in 2012, Bloomberg and New York Times reporters wrote some very good pieces on the overseas wealth of Chinese top leaders, including Xi Jinping's family. I've never seen a reaction like this from the top dogs in the Communist Party. They were furious. And Bloomberg rolled over. The New York Times only rolled over halfway, but that was enough. And this is something that the U.S. government should use this weapon, use this tool against them. And the fact we haven't, despite there having been recently a law, so I understand it, or a regulation put in by Marco Rubio calling for this, that nothing's been done. It's overdue, even just the report on this, but that's the way you hit them. And so it's when you're thinking about taking on the Chinese Communist Party, it's not just military to military. It's not a military question. But there's an economic approach to it, a financial approach, and you apply pressure in a way that is from a different direction and where they are vulnerable. And Xi Jinping tells President Biden this whenever they've met, don't weaponize trade. They hate tariffs. They hate sanctions. And whenever the Chinese communists are telling you not to do something, you should do a lot more of it. So we have a number of cards to play. And at the end of the day, we have an illegal immigration problem. The Chinese don't. And there's something about our system that we ought to be able to sell it. We used to know how to do this during the Cold War, but we seem to have forgotten about that. And, if you just remember you're Americans and what you're about, and as I say, play to your strengths and go after the enemy's vulnerabilities, that you'll find you have some success, and you'll find a lot more people are more willing to support you openly because they want in on a good thing as well. It depends on what time of day you ask me, that I can sometimes be very pessimistic and sometimes optimistic. But the thing is, as you've said, don't do anything that helps them, and also apply pressure where it's where it can be very useful. And you've got to build up your military. There is no substitute for it. You can use an expression like integrated deterrence, which is a fancy way of saying let our supposed allies do the hard work because we don't want to spend or do what's necessary. But there is no substitute for the hard power as well.
Absolutely. Well, you gave a pretty fulsome menu that a thoughtful leader of the United States ought to be choosing from. We pray that such a thing might grace us in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, why don't you share with our audience where they can go to track your commentary, to find your book, or anything else you'd like them to be able to do to continue today's conversation?
Sure. The book is, of course, right behind me, but it's available in the usual places you would find books, and you can get it online pretty easily. I have a Twitter account as well. It's at Newsham Grant, and then everything I write shows up on www.grantnewsham.com. It connects to sort of everything I've written and the talks that I've given, the interviews, etc. And as noted, I do try to write like I'm writing for my mother. That was the advice I was given, actually, when I started writing op-eds. An editor said, write like you're writing for your mother and be constructive. And the point was, you're not writing for the 12 people, in D.C. who are going to look at the footnotes and see if their name's in it and then shut it. But rather, you have some ideas after you've been around a while. And the idea is to tell a story, sort of explain things and raise issues and take from an angle that people haven't thought of, and try to help people understand Asia, understand the Chinese threat better than they currently might. So
that's a great nugget of an idea that people can take on this topic, but also their own work. For those who are just audio only, we'll just remind them the book is When China Attacks, A Warning to America. And we just really want to thank you, Grant, for taking time to talk with us today. For the audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Grant Newsham for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.